Is that the way it is? I mean, nobody can face that. It would lead you to anodynes, to various kinds of sugar-coated pills. That is, you have to cover it up. You would have to say, I can't stand that view of the universe. It would drive me crazy if I thought that was all there is. And so you would become, and there are various things you can do. You might become an aesthete. You might say, well, we're not going to look at it. What we'll do is we'll, as Nero did, play the fiddle. We'll say, no, we're not going to look at the universe. We're going to make up a world of our own, which is better. Go to the movies, take drugs.
Isolate yourself like Marcel Proust at the end of his life, you know.
That's what he did. Cork room.
Kind of cork-lined room with, they slide your food under the door, and you live isolated from all of that horrible reality.
I mean, that's what Bertrand Russell explicitly says.
Yeah.
I mean, Russell has the famous passage in one of his autobiographical sketches. He talks about the modern writer, poet, novelist D.H. Lawrence, and who was a very close friend of his at one time when they were both young men. And Lawrence said to him, Russell, do you shave in the morning? Russell said, yes. He said, well, why don't you cut your throat? You know, in those days they had these razors, these old-fashioned razors, straight razors. Because Lawrence said to him, anybody who holds your view, which is this view, essentially, anybody who holds your view of the universe should kill himself. I mean, why go on? And Russell says, that next day, that morning, I got up and I looked in the mirror and I looked at the razor and I said, he's right. I mean, and he said, I was about to slit my throat when I thought, gee, I have a book open on my dressing table there where I was reading when I fell asleep last night in mathematics. And I hadn't solved a certain problem. I think, and he put the razor down, and I said, just a minute, I'll be back, I'll kill myself, but I want to solve that problem, it intrigues me. So he said, I went back to the problem, and he laughed, because he was 90 years old. This was in an interview, I heard this on the radio, I'm trying to recall where I heard this was in an interview. And he laughed, and he said, I haven't solved that problem yet, ha ha ha, but he said, the razor is still there. The razor is still there. Yeah. Well, poor old Lawrence, with all his faults, he didn't hold this philosophy. He had something else, which may be, I don't know, worse. But he believed in some kind of spiritual thing. He believed. Yeah,
he went almost to the opposite. You'd say he really went to the opposite extreme. He had some sort of animist, dynamic view of the universe. This view is ultimate, although there's motion in this world. It's still ultimately an inert world, a static world. Which is all based on accidents of one atom bumping into another atom, everything just happening by chance. And in a way, the whole of the modern world has vacillated between those two extremes of an inert, deterministic world and a world which is dynamic, where anything can happen, where there is no reason for anything happening the way it happens.
He's an irrationalist.
Yes, an irrationalist world. When you get a world which is as unacceptable as the world of modern physics or of the atomism of Lucretius, which is simply another version of the same thing, people say, well, that can't be right. And they say that can't be. It doesn't make sense. It really just doesn't make sense. It's unacceptable. And then they say, well, the whole thing is founded upon a kind of rigorous approach to reasoning, which is unacceptable. And so the hell with the whole thing. It was D.H. Lawrence who said, "Damn the absolutes." For years I've been saying that was William James.
Yeah.
But it was Lawrence who said that.
Kidding.
Maybe James said it too. I don't know. Huh. But it was Lawrence who said that. I just read that the other day. He says, damn the absolutes, which is...
I don't know, I've got James in my head, but maybe
I
you're
know,
the one who
I
put it
heard,
there.
No, I heard you quote it. You were the one who quoted James. You misled me.
Oh, okay.
But I read this the other day. But it figures that's what he would say, no matter who said it the first time. But that is that there. You see, in a...
Well, James, it's certainly consistent with James.
Yes.
For other reasons.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah, same. It'd be the same.
But anyway, Lawrence would agree with it. Yeah.
Yeah, but in this universe, there are absolutes. In fact, there's nothing else. There's nothing but absolutes in the world of Lucretius.
What I would submit is simply that you can judge a philosophy in a number of ways. The philosopher himself, I suppose, judges it primarily by its origins. That is, he tries to drive it back to its fundamental principles. And that's what Aristotle does. That is, what Aristotle does is he takes the philosophy of atomism and he drives it back to its presuppositions and shows that they're contradictory and therefore that they're wrong. But another thing to do is to drive it forward to its consequences and say, well, suppose we took up this philosophy, what would we do with it? How would it relate? And this is what literary people tend to do. And I think what you have to say is, anybody who seriously holds this philosophy will go mad. There's no way that you can live with it. It is totally incompatible with one's own interior life. Well, with one's exterior life, for that matter, either. With one's experience.
It contradicts your experience.
Look at the world. It's beautiful. It is not. You can't tell me that sky that we're approaching, well, we're on an autumn day here. You can't tell me that that's some kind of sugar-coated pill, and that's not real, that it's all some sort of absolutely colorless, odorless, tasteless,
accidental collection of atoms. See,
doesn't
that's
correspond with my experience.
Yeah, that's. There's a passage in Book 5 where Lucretius talks about how the universe was not created for us. The world does not exist for us because man doesn't fit into the world. He's a kind of alien in the world. He says because the world is full of imperfections, and we have in us a kind of desire for perfection. So he says we're here, we're isolated and alienated in this world of atoms. Of course, we're made up of atoms too, but there's something strange about us.
We're alienated atoms.
We don't fit in this world at all. Mr. Senior was talking about the colorless, odorless rush of atoms. He's thinking probably of a passage from Whitehead. Whitehead talks about this. He says in a book of his that is the consequence of looking at the world in an atomistic way. Now, Whitehead was not an atomist himself. He was a colleague of Bertrand Russell's in his earlier days. And then he diverged from, he swerved, to use the kind of...
He became a kind of Platonist.
Yeah, kind of Platonist. Yeah. But he said that that is not a true representation of the world. But he said that, and I think it is partly because of the result. That is, he said that according to this philosophy, we live that the reality of this world is colorless and odorless and tasteless, and it's, in other words, everything that our senses tell us about the world is false.
Isn't that? You can't live with that.
You can't possibly live with that because your experience. Now, you see, that's the result of experimentation, not the result of experience. The two words are rather closely, they're intimately related to one another, but we know the difference between experimentation and experience always convinces us. We believe our experience much more than we believe experiments. That is, someone comes and tells us, well, the result of experiment shows that you really don't have, if you go into the doctor and you say, gee, I have this terrible pain in my stomach, And you go in and you see the doctor, and he takes a lot of tests. And he says, well, the result of all the tests is that you don't have pain in your stomach. There's nothing wrong with you. And you say, well, I don't care about all those tests. I've got this pain in I've got a real pain in my stomach. There's got to be something wrong with me. That's an experience that I know, and I don't care about your experiments. They aren't nearly as convincing as your direct experience of things.
Those guys always drive you to a chiropractor.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you go to some quack because at least they believe that you really hurt. But people say, well, you see, the grass isn't really green. That color isn't really there. It's just that the grass reflects all colors except green. But it's not really green. That's because of certain phenomena of light and of certain having to do with the nature of your eye and the nature of light and the reflective character of grass. And the ordinary person, or any person, ordinary or extraordinary, says, well, I don't care anything about all of that. Grass is green. The leaves are green, and roses are red, and violets are blue. I can see that immediately, and I don't. When people tell me that really the table is really in motion, that is, that it's not really solid, that it's really a collection of atoms moving all the time, you say, well, that may be true. I don't know. I can't verify that by experience, only by experiment. But it really doesn't have anything to do with the way I conduct my life. I'm still going to put the book down on the table, and I know if I go away in an hour and I come back, or in 10 years and come back, the book will still be there, lying on the table. It won't have changed a bit, even though you say the table is in motion. It doesn't have any consequences so far as the living of my life is concerned at all. Whether true or false, even if I thought it were true, it doesn't affect my real life in any way. So why should I take that into account at all?
I was reminded of Chaucer somewhere. I think he's talking about Lucretians, and he says they're drunk. When you talked about the table not moving, that is, if you drink enough, by golly, the table begins to move. They're like it's an image borrowed from Boethius, who talks about the drunk man who can't find his way home.
Yeah.
But I think Chaucer was specifically talking about the Lucretian view, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Or when you were speaking about the green grass and the table, I was reminded of the famous table of green fields. That is, I'm getting absurd here, which is one of the ways out of the atomic theory. That is, one of the things people do when they try to live with this notion. They believe the scientists. They say, well, you must be right. There isn't any grass there. It's really nothing but refraction of light, so forth. And this table is really in motion. Well, then the consequence of that is that my whole experience of life is absurd.
I'm living in an illusion that everything, and then you say, well, maybe those are just two examples. Everything must be that way. My whole relationship with my family, with my wife and my children and my father and my mother. Adams.
Myself.
My relationship, with myself.
Wow,
my thought.
Identity.
What is my thought? Well, my thought is Adams too. Lucretius is a very thoroughgoing man. He doesn't. He
takes it all away.
He takes it all. He takes it all. He says the gods. Well, he doesn't deny there are beings that you might call gods. He says, but they're made up of atoms. No, he says they're a different kind of atoms.
Refined.
They're very fine.
Glassy.
They're very, very fine. They're the smallest of all atoms. So that a god can walk through a wall because he is so. His substance is so refined.
Atoms can fit between the spaces. They're so tiny that they can just go right through the spaces.
Yeah. So he says, there are
thoughts can do that.
And thoughts are also made up of very refined atoms.
Dreams, I think. Didn't he say they were atoms?
Yes,
dreams were atoms. Very, very fine atoms.
Yeah.
Float around.
once you get a theory like this, you find that's the marvel of this book in a way. Again, the theory is an absolutely comprehensive theory. It covers everything.
It's perfect.
It doesn't leave anything out. Well, it has difficulties, of course. It has very great difficulties. Yeah. I suppose we should mention, as long as we're on the subject of the atoms, the great difficulty is the swerve in the atoms. The atoms don't. It turns out they don't just fall. See, he says they just fall, and he doesn't explain why, but he says what happens is they fall.
But they bump.
And things bump into them, but then it's not only that things bump, but how did something bump into it and cause it to swerve off to one side?
That is, these particular atoms form configurations together and become trees and stars. Yeah. And the question is, well, if they were falling through the universe
at the same rate of speed, yeah, there's no reason to think they're falling at different rates of speed.
Why would they possibly accelerate? Yeah,
or bump into one another. You see,
and he can't explain that.
See, in order to make the theory absolutely consistent and to make it account for, not consistent, but to make it account for the phenomena, that is, that it turns out that there are things like trees and stars and human beings, he has to say that the atoms occasionally swerve from their path and collide with other atoms, and they come into cohesion and they form these things that we see.
So the philosopher immediately jumps on him and says, "No, wait a minute. You said there were only two things to explain the universe: atoms and the void. But now you've added a third principle: swerve. And the minute you add that, wow, your whole theory collapses. Because where did that come from?"
Yeah. Well, now how do you account for that swerve? Why should there be a swerve?
That is a more philosophical refutation than the one that I was embarked on, which is a more literary one. That is, look at the consequences. You can't live with it. But the swerve argument is purely philosophical.
You see, Lucretius, following Epicurus, does believe that we have free will. Oddly enough, he isn't a determinist. I believe that's right. That is, that he isn't really an absolute determinist. Once again, he looks at the world and he says to himself, well, we still do have wills of our own.
How can we withdraw from it?
How could we withdraw from the very first passage?
How could you be an Epicurean and withdraw?
Yeah. If the world were determined, then you couldn't do that. So he concludes that we really do have free will. But how can you account for that? It doesn't fit the theory. That fits our experience, but it doesn't fit the theory. But when you introduce the swerve, then you have made it possible for there to be some kind of free act intruding into this universe of which seems to be absolutely determined.
Maybe the atoms do that. Maybe they swerve.
Yeah, they swerve. They
do it.
They
don't just fall.
No, they don't just fall. They have some sort of principle inside them that causes them to swerve. Well, there you go.
It destroys the whole theory. Yeah. So we could say that the atomic theory is self-contradictory at the heart, as well as having this consequence that nobody can live with it. I suppose as literary people or as commentators as we are on everything, we started out by saying that the great books are about everything. We're much more likely to talk about the consequences of this theory, which are just enormous. One of the things you can do is go crazy, just lose your mind. Another thing you can do is not to lose your mind, but to take a crazy position. That is the absurdist position. That is to say, I'm an irrationalist, and which is what D.H. Lawrence did, an absurdist, and say, well, I'm just not going to try to have a coherent idea of the universe. Another thing you can do is to take drugs, that is to dull your sense of horror. Another thing you can do is to brood on it, I guess. That is to turn it into a kind of poetry. And this is what the writers of tragedy do. In modern times, the author who comes closest to this, I guess, is Conrad. That is, you just kind of brood on it. You just say, well, it's a horror. It's a horror.
Mm-hmm.
And you write stories about it. You make a kind of self-defense by turning it into a subject of contemplation or art. These are the things that people do. Lawrence or Russell turned it into mathematics. You just say, well, I won't look at it. I'll spend my life writing on math, because math doesn't get you into this. It protects you from it.
Yeah,
it's safe.
In his old age, he turned to politics.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, began to talk about. He was the one who invented the phrase, "It's better to be red than dead." And he preached pacifism, and that we ought to, if the communists want to take over, well, let them take over. As if it made any difference. He went around preaching about it. As if he thought that it made any difference. You always wanted to say, well, what do you care? Anyway, why should you care? If the world is the way you describe it, what difference does it make about anything?
Conrad was very fond of describing in various places in his novels a certain kind of person who finds a solution to the problems of life by refusing to think about it. That is, digging into some little thing. He has in the Heart of Darkness, the beginning of the thing. The man, he's an accountant, and his whole life is simply predicated upon keeping his accounts straight. And Conrad says he was particularly good at making figure eights in the book. That is, he made perfect little eights, and he had all his numbers straight. Now, if you said to him, well, what are you representing by those numbers? He would say, no, we don't talk about that. Because Conrad said if he looked out the window, he was keeping accounts of how much ivory they brought from the interior in exchange for how many nuts and bolts that they brought from Europe. And the nuts and bolts were all rusted and rotting and going into the ground, and the ivory never got there in the first place because they were cannibalized somewhere on the way. But he kept his little books perfect, and at the end of the year, when the Inspector General came from Europe and said, well, let's see the books, they were perfect. Well, that's true, isn't it? I mean, we know people like that. In every enterprise, I'm sure, anybody knows that accountant.
Well, that's that Lucretian, again, that Lucretian detachment from life.
He found a solution to the problem.
Yeah. And that's the kind of solution that Lucretius himself counsels. He says, death is inevitable, and so the only solution is to sort of be detached from life. I think at the end of the last hour, at the last tape, I think we were saying that it does sound strangely like a kind of contemplative life.
Yes.
Like a religious life. And I don't think we fully, we really didn't quite, we left that question right at the end of the tape, as a matter of fact. Now it comes back to me. We were just going to start on that, and we were cut short. That is that the accountant is what reminded me of it. You see, the thing that he's accounting for are just numbers. The reality out there bears no correspondence to the number at all. Yeah, the reality is chaos. But he can keep his books quite oblivious to the reality of the things, and that's really the Lucretian position, is that the reality is terrible. And Lucretius himself, you see, well, one of the ways you'd say that Lucretius managed to live as long as he did, and he didn't live to be very old, was that he wrote this poem. Mm-hmm. That was his solution. He said, well, I'll write a great poem which embodies and describes this philosophy. And that will be my kind of lifelong solution, my lifelong preoccupation, which will hold off that terrible reality from me as long as I possibly can. And it does have a certain kind of, it sounds almost like a religious contemplative life, where I will I will, in his case especially, where he says, well, I'm going to withdraw to the tower and I will simply reflect on the nature of things, terrible as they are, and try to keep myself out of them as much as possible and deal with them only in a kind of intellectual way.
The famous meditation at the end of I guess it's the first book of St. John of the Cross's The Ascent of Mount Carmel, is often quoted. I don't have it within easy reach here, but it reads like a litany where he talks about nothing, everything is nothing, over and over again. Those verses of St. John of the Cross have often been quoted by modern nihilists. Ernest Hemingway quotes them or makes plays with them in his story. Nada is the word he uses. Was that a Spanish word for nothing?
Yeah.
He's Ernest Hemingway is a marvelous example of the modern writer who takes up this view, and then who says the only way you survive is to find something to do. In some of his stories, Hemingway has one of his best stories, very well written, called Big Two-Hearted River, is about a guy who goes fishing. And he says the whole meaning of life is in how you, tie the flies.
Yeah.
How you tie the flies. You find some, particularly if it's a physical thing, it seems to be the best. Something that occupies your senses, holds your senses together, and you just do that over and over and over again. And that way you survive. You get through life. That's just everywhere in modern literature, and it's a consequence of the Lucretian view of things. Now, you read things like that in the writings of the saints. What's the difference? Well, I suppose we could say that it is one of the principles of reality is that opposites, contradictories, reflect one another. That is, they look alike. As you approach the perfection of the opposite, which is the pure contradiction, as you approach that, you begin to take upon the appearance of the very thing that you're contradicting. The devil is the ape of God. That is, of all the creatures in the universe, most like God is the devil. As he has all the attributes of God, and they're all false.
He's the imitator, you see, of God. He consciously tries to imitate God, and he's a deceiver. He's a liar. Of course, that's his nature, is that he's a liar. So he's the very opposite of God, but he has all the appearances. In the practical order, the hardest person to recognize, say in the political order, is the man who comes along when there is a disaster and says, "Follow me." He looks like a great hero. He looks like a savior because he has all the external appearances of the savior. You just take one look at him and you listen to the way he talks and the promises that he makes and his reputation, and you say, well, this must be that aristocrat that we've heard about in Plato, the philosopher king, has come at last. But very often he is the very opposite. That is, he's the tyrant who, in many ways, he seems to be exactly like the greatest man, the aristocrat, and so people are deceived. That is, I think that was the phenomenon of Adolf Hitler. The Germans were not stupid, and they were in a state of terror. Germany was in a terrible condition. But Hitler came along, and they said, well, he must be this great man who has been sent to save us. That's how he presented himself.
And it was plausible.
It has certainly plausible. Yes. And it's those sorts of things worse. That is, we don't mistake somebody who is for being a very great man who is just a mediocrity. Really, There is a kind of greatness of the opposite. And their greatest device, of course, is to imitate the best.
If ugliness reached its perfection, it would be a false beauty.
Yeah.
It would have the appearance of beauty.
Yeah.
And if truth reaches if untruth reaches its perfection, it has the appearance of truth. Otherwise, it wouldn't deceive you.
Right.
A lie. Oh boy, a man has to be very smart to be a good liar. Yes, to be a perfect liar, you have to be a genius.
Well, one thing you have to do to be a perfect liar is to know the truth.
Yes.
And you have to know what the truth is, and then you have to make people believe that what you're saying is the truth, although it absolutely contradicts the truth.
It's much harder to lie than it is to tell the truth. You have to account for all of the discrepancies and make up plausible explanations. And if you've ever been involved in lies, and I suppose most of us have, you know how hard it gets. You start out with some little fib, and pretty soon somebody will say, "Oh, well, you so-and-so," and you think, "No, wait a minute, I better not say that, because if I was there, I couldn't have been here." And then so you start to fabricate, and it gets more and more and more complicated. Once you start out on that road of the lie, you'll go crazy. I suppose a certain kind of paranoiac is a man who starts out with a lie. He starts out to tell somebody a little fib, and it grows and grows and grows until his whole life becomes a total explanation for something that isn't so.
You find that you live in disparity with the real world. That is, you're living a double life. That is, that it's when your mind really goes to pieces on you, that your mind is trying to create some kind of reality that does not correspond to the reality outside of your mind. That's almost the definition of insanity. That is, the insane believe deeply, they have become convinced that their version of reality is the only true one, and that they know that it contradicts the reality outside of their mind. There's that disconformity between reality and the world made up by the mind.
I knew a teacher once, a very powerful and in a way, a moralist teacher who held this view of life, and who believed that the only way to survive was through art, was through aesthetics, and that you had to make up the whole of existence. As each man, that is your job. This is what he taught his students. Your job is to construct a way of life entirely of your own making. And he was very interested in cosmetics. That is, he said, we have an art of music, and we have an art of words, and we have a sight, but nobody has ever really perfected cosmetics. He thought that we should paint our faces as have green ears and green and orange noses and things like that, makeup, so that we would construct our own physical appearance. He himself wore makeup. Bizarre man, to say the least. But he was a follower of Oscar Wilde and the 90s, kind of surrealist and all that. But he really believed these things. And there's an anecdote about him that he once visited a friend who lived in the country, and he got off the train. In those days, people took trains out from New York City, and he got off the train and looked at the station, and the train went down the track, and he sort of panicked, and he looked at his friend who had invited him to the country, and he looked back at the train, and then he looked around him at the countryside, this little country station, railroad station, and he said, "This is going to win," he said. He said, "I see it. It's going to win." And he looked at the grass and the trees and the fields, and he was just really horrified. We're not going to be able to do it. We're not going to be able to do it.
Now, when you live in the city, where everything is made, everything is artificial, you begin to think that you can win. That is, that the artificial can win. It's only when you go out into the country and you see nature, the natural, that you doubt that.
And I think the Lucretian does have that experience. That is the spores and the funguses begin to grow, and he sees that he's not going to be able to shut it out. There's no way that you can do that.
Well, your world does get smaller and smaller and smaller. We haven't mentioned the great translator William Ellery Leonard. Devoted his whole life to Lucretius. He was at the University of Wisconsin, where I went to school. I didn't know him. I heard stories about him, though. I knew people who had been there when he was there, which wasn't much before my time. William Ellery Leonard was a very talented man. He was a poet in his own right, and quite a good one. That is, he was cut above average by certainly by any standard. And he was also a classicist, a classical scholar who produced a great critical edition of Lucretius, and then he did a poetic translation of Lucretius, which is one of the best. It doesn't happen to be available, I don't think, right now. The one that we've been using is this prose translation.
I think his may still be in print. It may be in the Modern Library edition.
Maybe
sure.
It may be.
It's considered, I guess, to be the best.
Yeah, it is a marvelous thing. He loved. He was utterly devoted. And once again, he was not a fake. William Ellery Leonard was not a fake by any means. His devotion to Lucretius was wholehearted. He didn't translate anybody else. He didn't do critical editions of Virgil. He was a Lucretius man all the way. And I mean all the way because he was also deranged. He was a man who had what I guess they call agoraphobia. That is, he was afraid of the wide open spaces. The opposite of claustrophobia. The claustrophobic is afraid of being confined, and the agoraphobic is afraid of the open spaces. And the world for William Ellery Leonard got smaller and smaller and smaller as he grew older. A friend of mine who did know him, who was there at Wisconsin at the time, I think it was Mr. Nelly, was the one who was saying that Leonard used to, he had an apartment down at the foot of the hill where the university is, and he used to go out from that apartment about once a week to go to the grocery store to make necessary purchases, and he would always take exactly the same path. He would never deviate from that path. But then he got to the point where he couldn't leave his apartment at all. He stayed in his apartment all the time, and he had people bring him provisions and supplies and things like that as his age advanced on him. And then he got to the point where he couldn't leave one room. He stayed in just one room. He used to have his classes in his apartment on a rug in his room, and he stayed on that rug. And then and everyone had to come and sit on the rug because he couldn't go outside of that. His world simply narrowed down, got smaller and smaller because the world outside was just so painful and so horrifying to him. He was finally hopelessly insane. A brilliant man, an absolutely brilliant man.
Insane because of his brilliance.
Yes,
that is,
exactly.
Again, Chesterton has that remark, doesn't he, that a certain kind of insanity, I don't suppose he means every kind, but there's a certain kind of insanity which is a consequence of of having too much reason.
Well, it's
not so much that you lose it.
You lose it. You have too much.
You have too much of it.
No, it is.
You have nothing but. I think he says reason. I think he says nothing
but reason.
Nothing but reason. And certainly Leonard illustrates that.
You can retreat into your mind. That's one of the great places to retreat to. That is what. But
isn't that what he advocates? That is in a way.
Yes.
That's what he advocates. Now, when someone says, but isn't that exactly what the ascetic monk does? Who says, withdraw? Isn't that what St. John of the Cross says to you in Ascent of Mount Carmel? And what you would say is, no. He says the exact opposite. I know I was arguing with people about this. Every once in a while, someone who thinks the thing through will say, well, what you seem to be saying is everything that I say except one thing. You say that the purpose of all this is to understand God. And what I say is, you leave God out. Now, aside from that, there isn't any difference. And you say, oh, well, yeah. It's a very little difference, isn't it? That is, in a way, yes, Lucretius does have a contemplative view of the universe, but it's without God.
Well, his is a negative, an entirely negative view. That is...
But I mean, externally or physically, materially, he does advocate doing very, very similar things. Very similar.
It looks like the same thing. Yeah. It's just that you say, well, what is the end of all of this? Where does it all lead to? We've been talking about consequences pretty much during this whole talk. Where does it all lead to? What is the end of your contemplation? Well, the end of Lucretius's contemplation is that the world is falling down. That is, that the whole world amounts to nothing. And that's it. That's it. Now, that's simply
that's
where...
truth, he says.
That's
the purpose of human life.
That's where he ends. And now St. John of the Cross starts there. That's just the beginning. He says, well, yes, in a certain way. He doesn't deny, of course, the goodness of the creation. He doesn't say that God's creation is nothing and that it's to be despised. He only says that, of course, by comparison to God, the world is nothing.
That's right.
The end, that's the beginning, is the creation of the world, and it's good. It's a means to our salvation. But of course, it's not an end. If you cling to that creation, of course, then you will have lost your soul. The end of all things is God, and the reason that we do withdraw from the world and that we enter into contemplation is that we contemplate God. We serve God.
One could imagine a Lucretian, an Epicurean, entering a Carmelite monastery and living the life perfectly. That is doing everything that he's supposed to do, following the blueprint, St. John of the Cross, but holding all the while that there's no God. You can imagine it would be a kind of interesting study. Superficially, he might accept the entire life and say, "This is the best life." I've heard Lucretians say that they have great admiration for monks. They say, "Yeah, they're right. They're the ones who really, they're living the right life."
Well, the garden, the walled garden of the monastery, the place of meditation. That's the same as it looks the same as the Lucretian garden.
They're often fascinated. I think that these nihilists, these atomists, are usually very appreciative of the contemplative monk. That is, they see in it something that they think is quite right. But just imagine what the contemplative life would be like if you were doing it for its own sake. As if the whole purpose of it were just to do it, and that there were no God. I mean, it's so bad that you just have to call it insanity. Although that's not strong enough a word. It's an insanity of the intellect, not just of the.
We call it an escape. You see, again, you'd say, well, where they really belong is in an asylum. It's what it is an escape. From the reality and nothing more. Nothing more. It's just an escape to get away so that they can be free from that, so that they can indulge their own. Again, it's the seeking of pleasure. This contemplative life is very pleasing. It's quiet. You're not involved in all of the stress and strain of the world and all of the ugly things in the world. And there are ugly things in the world. No one denies that. Least of all, St. John of the Cross. It's a world that is filled with sin.
But why St. John of the Cross says you are to do all these things that he says is finally that you are not doing it for yourself.
No, above all, you're not doing it for yourself.
See, again, the Lucretian lives for himself. He does it because he wants to be happy. That is, he's doing it for himself. And what the saint says to you over and over again, if that's the reason you're doing it, that's spiritual gluttony or avarice.
Epicureanism. Spiritual Epicureanism.
Yeah. And that's a horrible sin. That is, it's a sin against the Holy Ghost. It's an unforgivable sin. You must begin with service to God and end with service to God. That is the alpha and the omega of the whole thing is God. But with Lucretius,
it's
no
your
God.
own, it's yourself.
It's yourself.
That you're pleasing.